Tantor Audio presents The Wilderness of Ruin, a tale of madness, fire, and the hunt for America's youngest serial killer, by Roseanne Montillo, narrated by Emily Wu Zeller. Prologue. O Boston, city of our pride! O Massachusetts, our loved state! Thy faults we ever seek to hide. We for thy perfect glory wait. Poem read by Reverend Minot J. Savage at the death of Governor William Gaston. In the early hours of Thursday, August 1, 1929, crowds formed in front of the main gate of the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown, a sprawling compound of brick and granite encircled by a tall wrought iron gate. It was a warm morning and would become even more so as the temperatures reached as high as 95 degrees. Young mothers had risen early so they could make it to the prison, dragging their children along with them. Workers from the nearby factories had taken the day off, and the elderly men who had followed the notorious case for more than 50 years were lined up along the streets. Standing next to them on the sidewalk were numerous reporters from across the country, who did not seem to mind the heat. All of them had been drawn there by the fermenting curiosity of years past, and by more recent tantalizing articles. For days, newspapers in the region had been speculating about whether the people of Boston would get the chance to see Jesse Pomeroy again. Or, as the Boston Daily Globe wrote, would Pomeroy have a glimpse of the world denied him for 53 years? In recent days, those residing near the prison, and in the city at large, had been waiting to hear if Jesse Pomeroy would be transferred from the state prison to the Bridgewater State Farm, nearly 2 hours to the south of Boston. Originally built to house paupers from the state hospitals, the farm had now become a warehouse where hospitals, prisons, and other institutions dumped their so-called undesirables, those who could not be helped by routine treatments. On the evening of July 31, special editions were printed with headlines screaming that indeed it would be so. He would go on the following morning. 68-year-old Pomeroy was not happy about his transfer. He had entered the Massachusetts State Prison, or the Massachusetts Bastille, as it was often referred to, when he was barely a teenager, and his cell, number 19 in the South Wing, had become his home. He knew where each brick had a line running across it, most likely because he had chiseled it there himself. He had felt every wedge or crack the walls possessed with the tips of his aging fingers. He knew where his old cot sank beneath his weight, where his pillow had come loose at the seams. He knew which of the officers would be bringing him his meals simply by the distinct way that person had of jingling his key into the door. He knew what that meal consisted of, and how many minutes before the appointed hour it would arrive. Now he would have to leave it all behind in favor of a place where people donned not guns, as was customary, but white uniforms, as white as his eye. Jesse was adamant that he deserved a full pardon and had not wanted to leave until it had been granted. He felt so strongly about it that, as a final act of defiance, he'd even refused to pack his few belongings until a guard had made him do so, first gently, then with a little more force. Jesse's attorney, John Daly, had fought a valiant fight. He ardently believed that Jesse deserved to be pardoned because if he had been tried today instead of the 1870s, he would have been sent to a hospital for the mentally unsound, and not to the state penitentiary. He was a victim of circumstance, Daly argued before those members who had agreed to hear his plea. He proclaimed that Pomeroy's sentencing had occurred during an era when insanity was not considered to the degree that it was now. Daly was also in agreement with Pomeroy that he needed to be pardoned. He was so convinced of his argument that he'd even taken the liberty of coordinating with the Salvation Army, who had assured him a home would be provided for Jesse upon release. But something in Daly's eagerness and choice of words had unwittingly irked those on the panel deciding Jesse's fate. At one point, Daly had described Pomeroy's murderous actions as getting into trouble, which had seemed to trivialize the offenses. Daly's summations had also seemed to imply that the state owed Pomeroy not only his freedom, but an apology, which Jesse had been requesting for years. When the committee released their decision, they gave no validation to what Daly had expressed. If anything, the men felt that too much grace had already been extended on the prisoner. Pomeroy would not be pardoned. Instead, he was being transferred. On this August morning, Pomeroy shed the prison uniform he had worn for 53 years and changed into a borrowed suit, dark in color and 2 sizes too big. It hung ungainly from his body, the fabric alien on his sagging skin. In his pockets, he carried $1.66, part of his earnings from legal speculations with the stock market, and when he spoke to the minister, his breath smelled of hot beef hash and coffee, which he had consumed as his last meal on the premises. With the paperwork taken care of, the door to his cell opened and he was escorted into the corridor. It must have seemed odd that with a few twists of the key, he was able to step beyond the threshold of his cell, beyond the steel bars he had often tried to dislodge with contraband weapons. He walked slowly down the south wing of the prison and followed the hallway that led to a large rotunda, where a guard post was located. He looked up and saw the cells arranged in a circular formation, heard the shouts from the prisoners that in isolation he had never heard before, the ding of steel bars as they opened and closed. On entering the prison, some visitors compared the institution to a busy beehive, and so it must have looked to Jesse when he stared upward. As he walked out, he did not offer a thank you, a salute, or any kind words to the warden, James L. Hogsett, or to the officers who had taken care of him during the past years. He merely pushed the tip of a newsboy cap over his eyes and readied to walk outside, where the crowds awaited him. Guards posted near the prison's front staircase stared as the people surged forward by the locked gates. These officers patrolled the area holding bayonets and wooden clubs, making certain that a riot would not ensue. Taking drags from their cigarettes, reporters stood in the sun with pencils at the ready. It was a morning of tense silence, an editorial in the Boston Evening Globe stated later that evening, describing the moments prior to Jesse's arrival. Most of those who idled by the curb had been youngsters at the time of Jesse's roaming, protected by their mothers, whose fears had overwhelmed them. Along with them there were now young mothers, sisters, and some much older individuals who had been Jesse's schoolmates. For the most part, they remained calm and quiet. The only sounds they heard were the dings and whistles from the elevated trains running nearby, and the shouts of dogs in the distance. Occasionally a murmur arose when they thought the approaching hour was at hand, until it got louder and louder when from behind that big door arched as cathedral window set down the center was the answer to our gathering, continued the Boston Evening Globe. Warden Hogsett emerged from the main door, looking serious and pale, and began to chat with several of the uniformed guards. As a group, they moved toward the gates and eyed the crowd. Moments later, from behind them there appeared several more guards holding rifles, followed by 2 other inmates also being transferred, their shackled feet clinking as they walked forward. Jesse Harding Pomeroy left the Massachusetts State Prison at precisely 11:33 a.m., the rattling of his chains announcing a re-emergence into the sunlight. Although the sun was blinding, as he moved toward the car he saw the outlines of those who had come to see him and heard the shouts coming from their direction. He did not acknowledge their presence or the words they were hurtling toward him. Instead, he lifted his eyes toward a hot and unfriendly sky. He blinked several times, then headed toward a black sedan enlisted for the occasion and took a seat between the 2 other inmates, Daniel Watts and Giuseppe Malavia, also headed for Bridgewater. William I. Robeson, from the parole office, drove the car, while Joseph O'Brien, another state official, sat in the passenger's seat. A second black sedan followed them, carrying 3 more inmates to Bridgewater. As the people dispersed in the hot haze, they realized that something was amiss and anticlimactic in the way Jesse had been returned to them. From its very beginning, the newspaper articles had described Jesse as a beast, the devil, a larger-than-life individual lurking among the streets of Boston and leaving havoc and death in his wake. That's what the crowd had come to see, what the people had expected. But the man who had left the prison seemed shriveled and desiccated by time, not even of average height, a long mustache hanging limply by his cheeks, bearing the whole of his life under his arm in a small package wrapped in old newspaper and tied with butcher's string, like a Sunday roast. The person he had become had stunned them into silence, and as the sedan became a speck of black on the horizon, they quietly returned to their lives, to the breweries and the factories making buttons, to taking care of their children, and to their games of baseball in the nearby park. During the ride to the Bridgewater State Farm, Jesse remained quiet, almost solemn. As they moved from the prison grounds toward the Charles River, he looked out at the city that had developed during his absence, the buildings that had risen at the banks of the river. While in prison, he had been allowed to pass the time reading books and newspapers, and had memorized poems, sonnets, languages, geographical locations, historical facts, maps, and figures in order to keep up with the world. But now, looking out from the window, it seemed as if the speed in which the world in general had progressed in the previous 50 years had been faster than Jesse's reckoning. What he had not been a part of for more than 50 years now revealed itself on August 1, 1929. Indeed, it was the type of world his books and newspapers had described in detail, yet reality had not prepared him for. Bright, breezy, crowded, noisier than he recalled. There were no horses on the cobblestone streets he had trod upon as a boy. The click-clacking of hoofs had been replaced by the honking of automobiles whizzing by at the dizzying speed of 20 or 30 miles an hour. A grinding noise alerted him to an alien creature flying toward soft cumulus clouds, and looking upward he saw the wings of an airplane gliding across the blue expanse, machines unheard and unseen during his time. Trains lumbered across bridges extending from Boston to Cambridge, seemingly gliding over the waters of the Charles and carrying hordes of people through the city in a matter of minutes. Some rushed to work, their movements swift as they walked forward together, members of a group he had never joined. Others, in the midst of a recreational day, were making their way to Fenway Park, where the Red Sox were hosting the Cleveland Indians. The Red Sox would go on to lose the game 10-3, one of many losses in 1929, a particularly ugly season for them. The river flowed lazily from Charlestown to Boston, and on its banks were moored ships and small vessels of a practical nature, as well as tiny pleasure boats. And what to say of all those wooden poles erected everywhere, from which power lines were strung like Christmas ornaments? In Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, written in 1819, the titular character awakens from a 20-year sleep and finds himself in a world that has drastically changed. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been familiar haunts had disappeared. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. So it was for Jesse, and reporters who described this day's events called on Irving's story and its parallel with Pomeroy's. The prison warden also recalled the famous tale while describing Jesse's new adventure. On the next day, August 2, nearly every newspaper in the country, large and small, printed a story about his release. Connecticut's New Britain Herald was one of them. Pomeroy in his youth clearly had a defective mind, yet today he insists he is sane. Had he not been a youth himself, he probably would have been hanged for his crimes of 53 years ago. But this very fact that he was a youth at the time and has spent so many years in prison makes the case one that has attained worldwide interest, the editorial stated. Many agreed that life in prison had not been enough, but if the mere process of breathing, eating, and sleeping, merely existing amid concrete and steel cells, is preferable to death, then there is a difference in degree of punishment between such a term for life and execution. But life as we understand it and what we expect of it surely amounts to more than this. Pomeroy, in effect, has been dead for 53 years. He has suffered the pangs of remorse, the stir of conscience, and the pain of thinking about what might have been. But had he done any of those things? Had he become remorseful, felt his conscience stir, or thought of what might have been? Perhaps he thought of what might have been, most especially as the car left the courtyard of the Massachusetts State Prison for its 1 hour and 43-minute drive to Bridgewater. As they drove ahead toward his final destination, one cannot help but think his mind must have traveled back to the time when the streets were muddy and overrun with omnibuses, to a time when he ran atop the bridges away from his home and toward the waters to watch the fishermen dig their clams, to a time when the bakeries sold their sweets for a penny, buns he coveted even from his neighbors, to a time when his mother and his brother were still very young, and he was just a boy of 14, exploring, as he had done many times before, the crooked streets of his new home in South Boston, to a time when the children laughed as innocently as he had never done. Chapter 1. The Inhuman Scamp. The Sandman's coming in his train of cars, with moonbeams windows and with wheels of stars. So hush, you little ones, and have no fear. The man in the moon is the engineer. The Sandman. In the spring of 1872, a 12-year-old boy scurried across the bridge that led from Charlestown into the city of Chelsea. He had made his way across the wooden planks before, running southward along Bunker Hill Avenue and leaving behind Lexington Street, where his family had once lived and where he had been born on November 29, 1859. His mother had despised that apartment and the sheer smallness of it, despised the muddy streets that flooded with muck from the rain and the horse excrement from the animals passing by, despised the scum that collected at the water's edge from the factories nearby, and the stench that arose in the summer from the tanneries doing business across the bridges. Still, the boy had enjoyed the closeness to the stagnant river. Their new home, on 78 Bunker Hill Avenue, was slightly larger. It was located just steps away from the Bunker Hill Monument, which recalled the opening battle of the American Revolution. That battle had occurred on June 17, 1775, on Breed's Hill, where troops led by Colonel Prescott, General Putnam, and Major Brooks had fought against the British. It was also there that General Putnam uttered the infamous words, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes!" The monument was completed in 1845, well before the boy's birth. President John Tyler attended the opening celebrations, while the famed Daniel Webster had given a stirring oration, imparting such inspirational words as, "Let it rise, till it meet the sun in his coming. Let the earliest light of the morning gilded it, and parting day linger and play on its summit." People who visited the area on quiet afternoons were often struck by the monument, an obelisk of Egyptian-inspired design with a gilt urn pointing skyward. But living in the shadows of such a historical marker meant very little as far as the boy's mother was concerned. It was the actual space of the apartment she was worried about. The boy cared even less. For him it was the proximity to the bridge that mattered, as it linked Charlestown to Chelsea. Not far from his own home, the boy came across the Navy Yard, a sprawling compound occupying nearly 1/8 of the land in Charlestown. As busy as some of the Navy Yards in larger cities, it made a brisk business in building and repairing boats and ships and employed thousands not only from Charlestown but also from the surrounding areas. Every day these men could be seen hurrying to and fro on landings for transatlantic steamers such as the Warren Line, which traveled from Boston to Liverpool, England. But workers were also hired at several distilleries, their fumes emanating from long smokestacks by the wharves day and night. At the state prison, that large and imposing institution that swallowed up the better part of the Charlestown landscape, and at the McLean Asylum for the Insane, which had opened its doors in October 1818. Near the Navy Yard there existed one of the few empty plots of land that opened out into pasture land, as it was called, which backed up into a dilapidated warehouse called Moulton's Hall. This stretch of land had a very low beach ringed by willow trees, and in the summer the children of the area scampered there with lunch pails and long fishing poles. The boy had gone there many times before with his brother, Charles, when they were much younger. But now Charles no longer cared for fishing. 20 months the boy's senior, Charles had lately taken more of a shine to the neighborhood girls, even trying to grow a faint mustache to impress them. Though it was already spring, that day of 1872 had dawned gray and sleety as the boy crossed the Chelsea Bridge. He could detect the delicate smell of confections and bonbons emanating from Schraft's Candy Company, mingling with the strong scents coming from the nearby factories brewing ale. He did not stop to glance at the lead-colored waters of the Mystic River rushing below him, which bordered Charlestown to the west, but instead he held on tightly to the white-handled pocket-knife, several yards of rope, and a tight bundle of fabric he had brought along with him. Any businessmen on their way into the city would not have paid any attention to him as they passed one another. Prior to the bridge's development, the trip from Chelsea into Boston had been a roundabout horse ordeal that took the better part of 2 days. When the ferry service was started in 1631, the first of its kind in the country, it made the ride across the Mystic much shorter, albeit more dangerous. But the bridge, built in 1803, gave Chelsea new life. Crossing it from Broadway in Chelsea into the lower end of Charlestown now took only a short while, and farmers and businessmen could come and go freely carrying their products: fruits, vegetables, meats, milks, eggs, and cheeses to sell to grocers in the city. Though the bridge was now old and would soon require a great deal of refurbishing, the city of Charlestown was still in charge of paying nearly 2/3 of its upkeep. But commercialists didn't care about such details. Those who were busy with such matters of commerce and opportunity would not even notice a boy's comings and goings. He became part of the landscape. Quiet and pleasant in the early 1800s, that area of Chelsea, even its waters, held beauty and tradition. It was not uncommon for the Baptist Society to hold its Sunday baptismal ceremonies in the Mystic River, groups of families gathering at its banks wearing their Sunday best, and looking on as a minister dunked a small child into the chilly waters. But that ended with the advent of the ferry, and more important, with the bridge, as the area around Chelsea's waterfront began to develop, industrialists eyeing not its charms but how cheap and convenient it was. Most of the people in town had been happy to see Chelsea grow, but the wealthy, those who had summered on the waters and who had mansions located in and around the waterfront, found the new changes deplorable. Factories began to sprout. Coal from the Campbell and Company coal wharves, wood from George D. Emery Enterprises, whose mahogany was shipped all the way from South America. James S. Green even opened a stable for horses, not only selling them but even lending them out, the stable becoming larger and larger with each passing year. The factories fronting the river turned their backs to the mansions, their smoke and soot obscuring the water's views. And as more opportunities arrived, so did more people. The stately homes were replaced by cheap lodging for the factory workers and everything else that was needed for their care and entertainment. A ramshackle doctor's office, a small grocery store, even a tavern and a vaudeville theater. Where once there arose the fragrant smell of blooming gardenias, now residents had to accept the pungent odor of fresh horse manure littering the streets. Eventually the wealthy left the riverfront and gravitated inland, and without their money to keep up the area's physical appearance, it took on a dingy look that reeked of despair. It was here that the boy from Charlestown headed. 8-year-old Robert Meyer was the son of local factory workers who made their home in Chelsea and had lived there for several years. As they did for all the other children of the area's factory workers, the streets had become Robert's playground. These were now a plethora of untidy backyards, broken porches overgrown with leaves and refuge, and mangy dogs scavenging for food and chasing after rats. On this day, Robert was spending a late afternoon flinging pebbles across his small, messy garden, as he had done many times before. It was a cold day, the brisk wind carried off from the Mystic River banging the shutters of those homes nearby. Not long after he began his game, a boy he did not recognize, a bigger boy than himself, approached him. Of course, Robert's parents had told him to stay close to home and speak to no one. But this bigger boy smiled as he neared Robert. He seemed friendly, and, besides, Robert reasoned, he was a boy like himself. He was much taller than Robert and had to bend over substantially to collect several rocks from the mound Robert had gathered on the ground. The big boy quickly aimed the rocks at a gate nearby and at a window, loudly shattering it, until soon he became bored. He told Robert they should take a walk. Remembering his parents' words, Robert hesitated, and in sensing his misgivings, the boy from across the river told him the circus had arrived in town and wouldn't he like to go and see it. In 1872, P.T. Barnum's grand traveling museum, menagerie caravan, and circus train began to travel the country's railways, stopping at the many industrial communities. Like all the other children, Robert had heard about the penguins from Antarctica and the lions from the savannas of Africa, how conjoined twins twisted their limbs like pretzels, and about the ladies with long beards they groomed like men's. He'd also heard about the armless women who knitted fancy wear with their toes, and the ancient mummies arising from sarcophagi, and the vivisected animals, and the freaks of all kinds. Robert had never seen any of the wonders the big boy was describing, but they seemed fun. A curious boy, he could not refuse such an enticing invitation. As they sauntered away from Robert Street, suddenly the big boy turned away from the main road and followed a quieter one, leading not toward the town center, where he had told Robert the circus had set up its tents, but into a more rustic lane that led forward onto Powderhorn Hill. In 1634, an attorney named Richard Bellingham had moved from Boston, England, to Boston, Massachusetts. In his new home, he had ascended to the ranks of lieutenant governor, and although he made his permanent home in Boston, he had also purchased an expanse of land in Chelsea, where he had built a large estate on a slope he had named Powderhorn Hill. From there, he said, if he stood on the summit, he could see all the way across to Boston, and if he stretched far enough, perhaps to his childhood home of Boston, England. But that was many years ago, and the grandeur of the estate and of Powderhorn Hill had now disappeared, and only decaying shacks remained, those that had once belonged to servants. One could still see the city, but the hill had become lonely, isolated. Nearby swished a small, murky pond where dead leaves floated in winter, and tiny, inedible fishes swam in the summer. Whether or not Robert worried about the boy's change of direction is uncertain, but he became aware of his intentions soon enough, when the boy unexpectedly lifted him off the ground and catapulted him into the pond. Robert struggled to get back to the pond's edges, but the boy pushed him underwater, as if wanting to drown him. Moments later, the boy lifted him out, and though Robert tried to free himself, he could not, because the big boy was very strong and held on firmly before shoving him to the ground. That's when Robert felt something heavy land on the back of his head. He blacked out. Robert woke up as tiny flashes of light crossed his eyes and pain riddled his body. He was being dragged by his neck along a quiet road that felt bumpy against his aching limbs. He and the boy arrived at a small and dilapidated outhouse on top of Powderhorn Hill. Its smell was so rotten that Robert nearly gagged. Though he tried to scream, the boy quieted him by pushing a piece of rag into his mouth. The boy ripped the clothes from Robert's body, stripping him completely naked until he shivered. Then, using the rope he had brought along, he fastened Robert to a wooden beam. The rope cut deeply into the little boy's flesh. Robert was now fully conscious and could hear the boy's giggles as he danced around him, laughing and jumping back and forth, spewing out lewd words, over and over. Frightened, Robert watched as the boy crossed the small space and picked up a wooden stick. He then neared Robert and like a dog sniffed him. The terror he noticed in Robert seemed to thrill him, for with a smile, he landed the stick over his body, hitting Robert across his chest, his legs, and his genitals. The rag in his mouth prevented Robert from screaming, but he could feel the pain intensely. Moments later, the boy took the rag from his mouth and told him not to make a sound, and simply to do what he was being told. Robert nodded. Then the boy told him to repeat the words he said, foul words Robert had been told never to whisper out loud. Profanity was not allowed in Robert's home, and his parents punished him and his siblings if they ever heard them whisper such things. But the boy was big and bad, and the wooden stick painful, so Robert did as he was told. And as he repeated the words, he noticed something peculiar. Although his parents didn't approve, the boy seemed to like them very much. The louder Robert uttered them, the giddier the boy became. Soon even the boy's breathing changed. Robert saw that the boy now inhaled.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?